The affluent suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek was known for its manicured lawns, white picket fences, and a sense of security that the residents had grown accustomed to. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over garden hedges and children played safely in the streets. No one could have imagined that behind one of those pristine facades, a dark and twisted affair would unfold, leading to a brutal and shocking murder. It all began in the summer of 2019, when 35-year-old Lisa Cartwright found herself stuck in an increasingly loveless marriage. Lisa, a stunning woman with captivating blue eyes and a smile that could light up a room, had married her high school sweetheart David 10 years ago. On the surface, they appeared to have it all: a beautiful home, successful careers, and a seemingly perfect life. But behind closed doors, their marriage was crumbling. David, a wealthy real estate developer, was always away on business trips, leaving Lisa alone for weeks at a time. The loneliness gnawed at her, and their once passionate love had dwindled to a cold, distant relationship. Lisa found herself yearning for attention, companionship, and excitement, things that David no longer provided. That's when Jack entered her life. Jack Taylor was a 28-year-old delivery man who worked for a local grocery service. He was charming, with rugged good looks and an easygoing demeanor that drew people in. His life was a stark contrast to the opulence of Willow Creek. He lived paycheck to paycheck, juggling multiple jobs just to make ends meet. But when he first delivered groceries to the Cartwright household, something sparked between him and Lisa. It started innocently enough. A few extra smiles, lingering eye contact, casual conversation about the weather or the latest local news. But soon, the brief encounters became the highlight of Lisa's week. Jack, too, felt the attraction, and it wasn't long before their interactions became more suggestive. Lisa found herself looking forward to his deliveries, dressing up a little more than usual, her heart racing with anticipation. One fateful day, with David away on yet another business trip, Lisa invited Jack in for a drink after he dropped off the groceries. One drink led to another, and soon they were locked in a passionate embrace. Their affair escalated quickly, fueled by the thrill of secrecy and the intensity of their physical attraction. They would meet whenever they could, sneaking around like teenagers, oblivious to the fact that their illicit relationship was spiraling out of control. But it wasn't long before their steamy affair took a dark turn. Lisa, consumed by the excitement and novelty of her relationship with Jack, began to grow resentful of David. She felt trapped in a loveless marriage, bound by the golden handcuffs of wealth and social status. The idea of a life with Jack, free from the constraints of her current life, became an obsession. Jack, on the other hand, was starting to feel the pressure. The thrill of the affair was wearing off, replaced by a growing anxiety over the consequences of their actions. He knew they were playing with fire, and the thought of what would happen if David ever found out kept him up at night. But Lisa was relentless, constantly pushing him to make plans for a future together, a future that Jack wasn't sure he wanted anymore. Then, one evening, everything changed. Lisa had been drinking heavily that night, her emotions heightened by the alcohol and the frustration of another lonely night without David. She called Jack, begging him to come over. Hesitant, but unable to resist her, Jack arrived at the Cartwright mansion. As they sat together in the dimly lit living room, Lisa's demeanor shifted. She began to rant about how miserable her life was, how much she hated David, and how she wished he was dead. Jack was taken aback. He tried to calm her down, to tell her that she didn't mean what she was saying, but Lisa wouldn't listen. Her eyes were wild, with a dangerous mix of desperation and rage. And then she said something that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "What if he just disappeared, Jack? Then we could be together. No more sneaking around, no more lies, just you and me." Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew this was more than just drunken rambling. Lisa was serious, and she was asking him to help her get rid of her husband. Panic surged through him. He tried to laugh it off, to change the subject, but Lisa was relentless. She began to cry, pleading with him, saying that she couldn't live like this anymore. Jack knew he should have left right then and there. He should have walked out the door and never looked back. But instead, he stayed, torn between his desire for Lisa and the gnawing sense of dread that was building in his gut. What Jack didn't know was that Lisa's desperation had already set a deadly plan in motion, one that would end in bloodshed and ruin both of their lives forever. Over the next few days, Lisa's behavior grew more erratic. She was relentless in her calls and messages to Jack, constantly pressuring him to think about her proposal. Jack tried to distance himself, but the more he pulled away, the more Lisa clung to him, growing increasingly desperate. It was clear that she had reached a breaking point and Jack was trapped in the center of a dangerous storm. Lisa's obsession with eliminating David had now morphed into a full-fledged plan. She began researching ways to stage a break-in or make the death look like an accident. One day, when Jack came over under her insistence, she laid out her plan in disturbing detail. "I've been thinking about it, Jack," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "David goes on his morning run every day at 5:30 a.m., down that isolated path by the lake. If we catch him there, no one will see. We can make it look like a mugging gone wrong." Jack stared at her, his heart pounding. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was actually serious. The thought of attacking David, of taking another person's life, made him feel sick. He shook his head, trying to dissuade her. "No, Lisa, this is insane. We can't do this. I'm not doing this," he said firmly, hoping to snap her out of it. But Lisa wasn't listening. She leaned in closer, her eyes gleaming. "I've thought of everything. We'll wear masks, gloves. There'll be no evidence. I've even got a knife. It'll be quick and then it's over. We'll be free." Jack's stomach churned as she pulled out a large hunting knife from her bag, placing it on the table between them. The cold steel glinted under the dim kitchen light, a stark reminder of the reality of what she was suggesting. He felt trapped, his mind racing as he struggled to find a way out of this nightmare. Lisa reached out and grabbed his hand. "Please, Jack, I can't do this without you. I need you. If you love me, you'll help me." The guilt and pressure were overwhelming. Jack felt as though he was drowning, suffocated by the weight of her expectations and his own fear. He knew he needed to end things with her, to walk away before it was too late. But before he could muster the courage, fate intervened. On the evening of July 10th, just 2 days before David was due to return from his business trip, Lisa sent Jack a frantic message. "Come over now, it's happening tonight." Jack's heart sank as he read the words on his phone. He knew he should ignore her, but a morbid curiosity and his complicated feelings for Lisa drove him to the Cart mansion one last time. When he arrived, he found Lisa pacing the living room, her eyes wild and her face flushed. On the coffee table lay the knife, a pair of black gloves, and a mask. "I've made up my mind," she said, her voice firm. "We're doing it tonight. David's flight got cancelled, and he's coming home early. We can't wait any longer." Jack felt his world spinning. This was it, the point of no return. He tried to reason with her, to convince her to abandon this madness, but Lisa was beyond reason. She grabbed the knife, shoving it into his hands. "You promised me, Jack. You said you'd be there for me. Don't back out now. We do this together, or I do it alone. And if I get caught, I'm telling them everything." Jack's hands shook as he held the weapon. He knew he should run, call the police, do anything but stay. But fear and love twisted his judgment, clouding his mind with confusion and dread. He felt powerless, trapped in a web of Lisa's making. A few hours later, just before midnight, David walked through the front door, exhausted from his long journey. Lisa greeted him with a glass of wine, her demeanor cool and composed. They exchanged small talk as David unwound, unaware of the horror that awaited him. Meanwhile, Jack was hiding in the guest bathroom, his heart hammering in his chest. He could hear their voices, muffled but clear enough to remind him of what he was about to be part of. His grip tightened around the handle of the knife, his palms slick with sweat. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to get out, to run far away, but his legs felt like lead. Then he heard Lisa's signal, a loud crash in the kitchen, as if she had dropped a glass. His body moved on autopilot, his mind blank as he stepped out into the hallway. David was still in the living room, his back turned, looking towards the kitchen where Lisa was standing. Jack took a deep breath and approached, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. David barely had time to react as Jack lunged forward, his movements clumsy and desperate. The knife pierced David's side, the shock and pain contorting his face. He stumbled, gasping, his hands grasping at the wound as blood began to seep through his shirt. Lisa rushed over, a look of twisted satisfaction on her face. "Do it, Jack! Finish it!" she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked. Jack hesitated, his stomach churning with revulsion and fear. But Lisa was relentless, pushing him forward, her hands on his shoulders, urging him to end it. Driven by her frenzied encouragement and his own spiraling fear, Jack struck again and again, each blow sending shockwaves through his body. David's screams echoed in the empty house, a haunting symphony of pain and betrayal. It was over. David lay still, his body crumpled and lifeless on the floor. The living room was a scene of carnage, the once pristine space now stained with blood and the stench of death. Jack dropped the knife, his whole body trembling, the reality of what he had done crashing down on him. Lisa knelt beside her husband's body, a strange smile on her face as she reached out and closed his eyes. Then she stood up, her eyes meeting Jack's. "It's done," she whispered. "We're free." But as Jack looked at the blood on his hands, the lifeless body at his feet, he realized that freedom was the last thing he felt. Instead, he was shackled by the weight of his actions, bound to Lisa and this horrific crime they had committed, and he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of their nightmare. The aftermath of David's murder was a blur of chaos and panic. Lisa, despite the cold calculation she had shown earlier, now seemed overwhelmed by the bloody reality of what they had done. She moved quickly, instructing Jack to help her clean up the scene. They wiped down the surfaces, disposed of their gloves, and gathered their clothes, all the while avoiding the lifeless body of the man they had just killed. Lisa, her hands trembling but her voice steady, directed Jack to wrap David's body in a plastic sheet she had prepared earlier. Jack's mind was reeling, his body moving mechanically as he followed her orders. He could barely process what was happening. The enormity of his crime bore down on him, each passing second feeling like a ticking time bomb. He knew they had to act fast, but his mind was a whirlwind of fear and regret. "We'll put him in the trunk of my car and take him to the lake," Lisa whispered, her voice a hoarse whisper. "There's an old boat ramp there, secluded. We'll weigh him down and dump him in the water." Jack's stomach turned at the thought, but he nodded, his voice caught in his throat. The two of them carried the body through the garage, the weight almost unbearable, both physically and mentally. Every step felt like an eternity, the silence around them suffocating. They managed to heave David's body into the trunk of Lisa's SUV, slamming it shut with a finality that made Jack shudder back. The drive to the lake was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and Lisa's heavy breathing. Jack kept glancing at her, hoping to find some sign of regret or fear in her expression, but her face was set in a mask of grim determination. The cold, dark eyes that had once captivated him now terrified him. How had he let himself get pulled into this madness? They arrived at the lake under the cover of darkness, the night air cool and still. Lisa drove to the deserted boat ramp, the headlights illuminating the still water beyond. They worked quickly, pulling David's body from the trunk and dragging it to the water's edge. Lisa had brought along cinder blocks and rope, which they used to weigh down the body. Jack's hands shook as he tied the knots, his fingers slipping on the wet rope. The reality of what he was doing hit him with full force, and he had to fight the urge to vomit. How had it come to this? How had he become a murderer? Lisa, on the other hand, seemed to be in a trance, her movements robotic as she secured the blocks. When they were done, she stood up, staring down at the shrouded form of her husband. Jack watched her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "Let's get it over with," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Together they pushed David's body into the water, watching as it sank slowly, disappearing into the murky depths. For a moment, they stood there, side by side, staring at the ripples spreading out across the surface. It was done. The man who had once been her husband was now nothing more than a secret buried at the bottom of the lake. But as they turned to leave, something shifted in the air. The silence was broken by the distant wail of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. Jack's heart stopped, panic seizing him as he realized what was happening. Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with fear for the first time that night. "Someone must have seen us. We need to go now." They ran back to the car, their breath ragged and uneven. Lisa fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Jack looked around, his mind racing for a way out, but there was none. They were trapped, the reality of their actions closing in on them like a vice. As the police cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing in the darkness, Jack felt a cold, crushing sense of dread. It was over. There was no escape, no way to undo what they had done. He turned to Lisa, the woman he had once been so infatuated with, and saw only a stranger, a desperate, broken person who had dragged him into this hell. "Don't say a word," Lisa hissed as the officers approached, her voice a frantic whisper. "We can still get out of this." But Jack knew better. He knew there was no getting out of this, no escaping the consequences of their actions. As the police surrounded them, shouting orders and shining their flashlights in their faces, he felt a strange sense of relief. At least now it was over. At least now the nightmare would end. The officers cuffed them both, reading them their rights as they were led to separate patrol cars. Jack's mind was numb, his body exhausted. As he sat in the back of the car, staring out at the dark waters of the lake, he he realized that he had lost everything: his freedom, his future, and most of all, his soul. Lisa looked back at him as they drove away, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. But Jack couldn't bring himself to care. He was done with her, done with everything. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The police had been tipped off by a neighbor who had seen their suspicious activity that night. The investigators found traces of David's blood in the house, and their search history on their phones sealed their fate. Lisa received a life sentence without parole. Jack, due to his cooperation and testimony against Lisa, received a slightly reduced sentence. But he knew he would never be free from the guilt and the memory of what they had done. As he sat in his cell, day after day, he thought about that fateful night and how his life had unraveled in the blink of an eye. He had been blinded by lust and manipulated by a woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. And now, all that was left was the cold, harsh reality of his choices, a reality that would haunt him for the rest of his days.